Hi, everybody. This is Chris, and I am here with a special guest, Mr. Eric Burns. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
I'm happy to be here, Chris.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And the reason why you're here today is because I read your book a couple years ago about 1920, and that book has really come back to me as we've grappled with 2020. One thing that I was reading this article, and it talked about how, like, oh, it's never happened before that you've had a pandemic, race relations, an election, everything, economic depression, everything bad happening all at once.
Everything wrong.
Everything wrong.
Everything.
All at once. And they're like, no, it never's happened before. But I was like, wait a minute, I've read this before. It has actually happened before. It happened in 1920, in fact. And so just as a little bit of a background, what made you want to write about 1920 of all years?
Well, I thought people had an erroneous idea about 1920, because when you think about 1920, the first thing you think of is flappers. And I had a conversation, as a matter of fact, with the artist, and I said, whatever you put on the dust jacket, don't put flappers, because that's not representative of the 20s. The 20s were a very difficult time for a lot of people, and we will get to that during this program. The Depression was just starting to show its roots, many other things too, but it was an excellent precursor to what has happened since.
And so, you had like an election. You had Woodrow Wilson, who was thinking about running for president, but opted not to run for president. But he had a stroke, and basically, I think it's fair to say, had kind of an erratic leadership in his last years. What leadership he had. You had the Spanish flu that was ongoing, which killed millions of people. And you had issues involving race, where thousands of African Americans, Tulsa was burned in 1920. There were a lot of issues of race going on in America in 1920. So why don't we start off, just given what's going on now today in America, could you talk a little bit about the race issues that were happening in 1920?
Well, let me talk about the reasons that they happened in 1920 and the reasons that they're happening in 2020. In 1920, the main issue among blacks was among soldiers who were coming back from really noble service in World War I. In fact, if I remember correctly, Theodore Roosevelt led a troop of Black soldiers in the Spanish-American War and had nothing but praise for them. They came back and expected two things. They expected to be rewarded financially somewhat, and some of them didn't get paid at all. And they expected their jobs that they had to leave to fight in the war to be held for them. Well, that didn't happen either. So it wasn't just an ordinary time of racial unrest in this country. There were these two extraordinary post-war factors. Today, I think it's fair to say a lot of people are at least somewhat puzzled by what has happened in race relations, but it should have happened long ago. It's interesting that the George Floyd incident triggered it, and I say that because it was brutal to watch, and that's the reason it triggered what's happening now. Just the sheer brutality of it. But he wasn't a name that anybody knew. It's the kind of event that could have been, by journalists and certainly by athletes, ignored, but it wasn't. And the amazing irony is, Chris, since what happened to George Floyd, things have gotten worse. Police shooting blacks. I've forgive me, I've forgotten the name of the fellow who was shot the other day getting into his car.
Oh, in Wisconsin. Jacob.
Yes. When I saw the video, what surprised me even more than knowing what had happened to him was that he was bent over in the car already. He wasn't standing outside and he wasn't opening the door. He had leaned over into the car. So all of those shots went into the back of a man who wasn't even standing straight.
Mm-hmm. Right. And in the 1920, the kind of racial violence that we saw, that was it wasn't necessarily black, African Americans doing the rioting, right? It was basically white people kind of doing the rioting. White people were the ones that were attacking black towns, attacking black cities, attacking black areas. It seemed like white Americans were very hostile to the fact that so many black soldiers came back and were demanding rights. And the same thing happened after World War II as well. Do you have a sense of what drove white America to react so violently back then to Black Americans asking for and demanding rights in 1920?
There's a book I'm reading now called Caste. I don't know if you're familiar with it, by Isabel Wilkerson. And that's one of the issues that she addresses, that this kind of caste relationship between blacks and whites, although she doesn't refer to it as a race, she refers to it as caste, has always been under the surface. And the purpose is often, when it's instigated by whites, to establish their primacy in the social order, in the caste order. Now, there was one incident that this isn't white starting it, but this is a white man in the White House exacerbating it. I think it was Brownsville, Texas.
Yeah.
Where there's an army base, and someone was killed outside the base, or maybe in the town. And the assumption was, I don't think anybody knew who did the shooting. The assumption was that it must have been a black soldier. Law of averages. Well, there was never any proof that there was. There was some circumstantial evidence that there wasn't. And Roosevelt, instead of interceding, which is the kind of thing you'd expect a progressive to do, backed every decision by law enforcement, which was the kind of decisions we see by law enforcement today, and every decision by the courts. And he went along with the punishment of the blacks. I think it was, we're going back 100 years now, I think it was to close down the base.
Yeah. And I think he actually dishonorably discharged all the African American soldiers.
Dishonorably discharged, yes.
Yeah.
And this was the man who, as I mentioned a few moments ago, was praising African Americans for their valor in battle.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of presidents, and I don't want to get too deep into like the analogies, but Woodrow Wilson, again, he had suffered that stroke, and after that stroke, exhibited a lot of erratic leadership over America, especially in his last years.
Chris, I'm sorry, let me interrupt you for just a second. Nobody knows for sure what happened that year and a half, because he stayed in the bedroom the whole time, except for being literally propped up, and not speaking at a couple of cabinet meetings. The thinking on the part of some people is that we had at that time our first female president.
Right.
Because the way you got a message, no matter how important it was to President Wilson, the door to his bedroom was open just a crack. You gave a note to Mrs. Wilson. She took it in, closed the door, so there was no way to hear outside, and either took down dictation from the president, or more than likely, at least some of the time, put down her own views and passed them off as the president. So it was a hard time to figure out who was in the White House and making decisions. I'm sorry for the interruption, but
no, it's very, very true. It's a very interesting point that at that time when you needed exceptional American leadership, we might have had one president, we might have had another president. We really didn't know.
We might have had one president too many.
We might have had one president too many. That's right. And it's interesting that when the pandemic first happened in America, there was a huge debate. Not even a huge debate. A lot of Americans were like, no, we don't need masks. And then all of a sudden the CDC said, well, yes, we do need masks. And there was a lot of Americans were like, no, we don't want to wear masks. And some Americans are like, well, we do want to wear masks. And it's fascinating to me that in 1920 and between 1918 and 1920, we saw these very same debates. And if you actually Google and look for photos of people in 1920, you see them wearing masks at baseball games and football games. And it's just insane how I don't think that was ever taught to me in history class that people actually wore masks in America in the 1920s. Or could you talk a little bit about the Americans at that era and why they wore masks and how they came to that conclusion that masks were something that they needed to wear?
Well, I think that the fact that there was no outward rebellion, as there is today, against the president, so much dislike aimed at the president. I don't know if it's a majority of Americans who do or not, but much that comes from the White House these days is suspect by a lot of Americans. Back then, we had more trust in government. This was before President Johnson lied to us. The first time that we knew a president lied to us, before Richard Nixon about Vietnam, before Richard Nixon lied to us about Watergate, we trusted government. Those two incidents were the biggest turning point in this country's history when it comes to the attitude of the public toward the White House. So the announcement comes from the White House that masks ought to be worn. And I saw that same picture you did, Chris, the people at the baseball game, all of them wearing masks, all of them, by the way, sitting right next to each other. So there was no
social distancing,
no 6 feet. But I think it was, people are fond of saying that the past was a more innocent time. In some ways, it was innocent in the sense that we had more faith in government. And if the government told us we needed to wear masks, and there had been news stories already, this was called the Spanish influenza. There had been news stories from
although it didn't start in Spain. Although it didn't start in Spain. It started in America.
Yeah.
The American flu.
There was evidence already that it was doing a great deal of harm in other places. So those factors put together.
And in fact, I want to share a quick picture with our audience here. It's a picture of a family wearing a mask, and apparently even a cat wearing a mask in 1920 in 1920 America. That's how common it was. Even the cat had to wear masks back then.
And isn't it strange today, Chris, that so many people are wearing them and so many people aren't?
Yeah.
I saw a couple walking down a street in New York last week. The man was on the outside, the wife on one side, the wife was on the other side. And in between, they were holding the hands of, I don't know, a 7, 8, 9-year-old boy, father wearing a mask, mother wearing a mask, the child not wearing a mask. And you go to a dining area, you'll see some people wearing masks, some not. It seems to be, as it wasn't in 1920, a matter of real controversry.
Right. And well, I mean, there was apparently there was an anti-mask league in San Francisco in 1918, 1919. A minor group called the Anti-Mask League of San Francisco, where they just thought that it was they thought it was like their God-given right not to wear a mask. So I guess there's some things that are authentically American, but it was a pretty small group though.
Didn't they think that God might have been kidding? It was so obvious that masks should be worn.
Even when writing is on the wall, no, it's true. It's very, very true. And so, in 1918 and 1920, we had a presidential election as well in 1920. Could you talk a little bit about having a presidential election in the middle of racial strife, in the middle of a pandemic, which was kind of going down, but there was still a pandemic ongoing, and also just some of the candidates that were running in 1920?
Well, it wasn't a distinguished two that were running. Calvin Coolidge had taken over for Warren G. Harding, who had taken over for Mrs. Wilson, who had taken over for Mr. Wilson. And Harding was a businessman in Ohio who it was said often looked president. He looked the role of a president. And an Ohio senator named James Cox, apparently there was no worry then about balancing the ticket, ran with him.
No, James Cox was the Democrat. That's right. I think James Cox was the Democrat, right?
Did I misspeak there and call him?
Yeah.
Who did Harding run with?
Coolidge. It was Harding and Coolidge ran together.
Cox, that was the year Cox ran for president.
Yeah, Cox ran with FDR.
There were two,
Yeah.
which was the start of FDR's career, really.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
made it
Pre-Polo.
yeah, and by the way, the end of my career for getting the president of the United States.
Not at all. Not at all.
Candidates wrong. It was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. No one's going to remember.
Anyhow, it's Cox was from Ohio. He was a senator. Few people knew him. The issues then did not seem to be issues with the strength and with the vitriol. Certainly weren't expressed with the vitriol that they are. Harding, hardly campaigned. I'm sorry, Coolidge didn't.
No, Harding. You're right. It was Harding.
Harding didn't campaign at all.
Yep.
Well, he campaigned a little, but mostly he sat on his front porch, believing that he was the incumbent, and that that would make him a kind of tourist attraction, and that people would come to see him. It worked, but it wasn't adopted after that. It was I wouldn't remember the percentages now, but it was a fairly low turnout. And as I say, once the winner was announced, there was no jubilation in the streets.
Yeah, it's fascinating that the current Joe Biden is being criticized from campaigning in his basement, and I've heard like some commentators say that, well, you can't win an election if people aren't passionate about you. You can't win an election from campaigning in your house. And I point to 1920 and I say, Warren G. Harding is a perfect example of somebody who basically campaigned from his house. He told America, I'm going to return you to normalcy, which isn't a word, but normality. And that was enough for Americans. He won by 60% of the vote, or almost 60% of the vote. And really,
he was, after all, Chris, outside on the porch.
Yeah.
So we'll give him that much credit.
We'll give him that much credit. He was on his porch. But it's fascinating how Americans at that time really felt that, given the chaos from the White House, given the chaos in the streets, given the pandemic, given the economic issues going on, that, this guy who was basically like, look, I'm just going to put it back as it was. And that was enough to win on by a substantial margin.
Well, Harding had that presidential demeanor, which his vice president, to name one, didn't have. Cox may have had, but nobody knew who he was. The interesting thing about Harding is that many people believe the present administration has taken over first, or if you will, last place in this category. But Harding's was thought to be, up until the present, and still is by many people, the most corrupt administration that this country has ever had. And I won't say that he gets a pass for it, but what he did so that he would feel comfortable having friends around him in this place that was so much more elegant than his store in Ohio, he had a gang, the Ohio gang, they were called, his friends. They came to the White House. They played poker there, sometimes with Harding, one night a week. And they pulled off one of the biggest scandals, maybe until Watergate, the Teapot Dome scandal, named after the shape of a rock under which there were tremendous United States naval oil reserves. And they were stolen. They were stolen by a man named Doheny, who is now the eponym of a street in Los Angeles. Several other of Harding's best friends, but Harding's density, Harding's lack of ability played for him, because he would say, I didn't know about this. I didn't know about this. And I believe that there was at least some of it that he didn't know about. He was so far out of the mainstream of what a presidential, a man holding the presidential office should be, that it was easy to believe that they pulled it off behind his back.
Right. And when he was running for president in 1920, that was sort of a strength, right? He was like, well, look, like, this country's messed up. And in a way, you said that he was running as an incumbent. It wasn't that he was an actual incumbent, but he ran from a position of strength. He ran from that position of like, well, the Democrats have been in charge for 8 years. The country's in chaos. Streets are burning. We have riots. We have all these bad things coming on. And I'm just this normal man from Ohio. I'm not trying to like change your life. I'm just trying to get us back to normal in that way.
Yeah, I should have said the incumbents party. Thank you. But
yeah. It's interesting that one other thing that's a bit of a parallel is the Attorney General under Wilson and sort of the Palmer raids. Could you talk a little bit about the Palmer raids and what was going on with that in comparison to what's going on today?
I don't think we've ever had anything quite like the Palmer raid.
Mm-hmm.
Palmer was the Attorney General. He was a Quaker, and his nickname was the Fighting Quaker.
Mm-hmm.
Those who didn't like him called him the Quaking Fighter. And there was, because of the results of World War I, there was a tremendous and unwarranted, as has usually been the case, fear of communists. Mm-hmm. The Palmer raids were aimed at suspected communists, maybe a precursor to what McCarthy did. Who knows if McCarthy even knew that much history? But he would gather federal troops. He would gather militias. He would gather all of the fighting men, mm-hmm. not men who fired guns, but all of the men that he could, who would just barge into houses looking for communists. One of the houses that they barged into was Warren Harding's, mm-hmm. and he had to prove to their satisfaction he wasn't a communist. But it was a very, very controversial matter. In this country, no one had ever gone on what we would now call a witch hunt for that reason. Mm-hmm. Communism to that extent.
And it's interesting how, A.G. Palmer just abused so many civil liberties and civil rights of Americans who, whether they were protesting or, whether they were opposed to his candidacy. And it's also funny that J. Edgar Hoover was kind of an understudy of Palmer. And his rise to the FBI came through Palmer. But a lot of what happened in 1919 and 1920 in terms of the Palmer raids were really about stifling civil liberties of a lot of Americans. And it's unfortunate that, we're seeing some of that again today in the United States. Do you think that there are any, what do you think are the most obvious parallels between 1920 and 2020? What are some things that jump out at you?
In any of the categories?
Yes, in any of the categories, that's right.
Well, there's no anti-mask league now, but there are people not wearing masks. I think that corruption is the issue that jumps out at me most, whether Harding knew of it, how much of it, and to what extent our present president went with corruption. But we know about Teapot Dome and various other things that happened in the Harding administration. There is no absolute proof yet that this president is corrupt, but I'd like to be an attorney trying the circumstantial case. These have been hard times. They were both hard times. Post-World War I was a hard time for people who couldn't get jobs. This is because of the pandemic and because of certain financial policies put into effect before it. This is also a difficult time for people to get jobs. And in both cases, blame fell on the White House. A point about the demonstrations. I haven't read of many, very few actually, one in Chicago, Haymarket Square, but very few protests with any degree of violence that happened around 1920, because that was for some reason thought to be a tool of the working man. We had more strikes by unions in 1918, 1919, 1920, the Homestead riots, so many. It just didn't enter the public mind that we could also protest not what the boss of the factory was doing, but what the head of the country was doing. And of course, a big difference between what happened then and what happened in the 60s, which I know is not one of our topics, but the peacefulness of the demonstrations these days, I think is quite remarkable, and making a point that violence couldn't make.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, again, 1920, 1919, I think there were over 240, 250 issues of racial strife. And when I say racial strife, I mean white areas of town attacking black areas of town, or black people doing minor protests and being attacked for it. I did.
Lynching was still, I don't know if it was illegal in some states, but I don't think a federal law had been passed yet. So there was still lynching at that time.
Yeah.
And kids going, it was a picnic event. I remember reading once about the Civil War. I forget which battle it was, maybe Gettysburg. People from both sides getting on opposite sides of the hill to watch the battle, bringing picnic lunches. And cheering for their sides. Something analogous happening here, I think.
No, it's true. Yeah, that was Bull Run, the first battle of Bull Run.
Was it Bull Run?
Yeah, they brought like a bunch of picnic tables out because they thought the Union was going to win in a rout, and then the Union started losing, and they all had to run back to Washington, D.C., literally on their horses and with their feet.
A lot of food went uneaten.
Yeah. So I do have like one final question for you. If you were just thinking about the comparisons between 1920 and 2020, and let's say that if you were advising Joe Biden or advising a presidential candidate who's running, like what advice would you give to somebody running for office in 2020, just from the lessons that were learned, you think, from 1920?
That's a really interesting question, and I'd like to back up a little because Harding got to the White House on the basis of this word that he coined, normalcy, which is now in the language. And that is how Biden is hoping to get to the White House. A few years ago, even Democrats thought we don't have a solid candidate to run. We don't have a named candidate to run against Trump, but Trump has run against himself so well that it could be Biden's low-key manner, which in a lot of elections would have hurt him, will in this case help him. It depends, Chris. I hate to say something like this, but it depends on the degree to which American voters are gullible. If they are going to believe everything they've heard from this president, who has been known to contradict himself within the same paragraph, which is a hell of a feat. It wasn't a long paragraph either.
Maybe even a sentence.
Yeah, I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. But if enough people think that he's doing the right thing by them, and he's such a wonderful performer, we must admit that, compared to Biden. I mean, if they were... Ed Sullivan would not have booked both of them.
No, you booked Donald Trump.
He would have. It would have been Trump who would book.
But I would much rather Donald Trump be on TV than in the White House.
Sorry,
I'd rather he be on TV than in the White House. I will gladly watch 20 more years of The Apprentice. He's not in the White House.
So what seemed and still does seem somewhat, although Biden is in some polls ahead of Trump and in other polls about even with him, but what seemed a disadvantage is that although he doesn't have any flash, he does have integrity and honesty on his side as far as we know. I think for that reason, not only will the two candidates be strongly opposed to each other in terms of issues, but strongly opposed to each other in terms of language when they debate. Who knows what Trump might call his opponent. And as far as Biden is concerned, he will be responding, I think, as the Black protesters have responded in a measured, quiet way, making the point. So it's going to be an immense distinction. We are a country that tends to like flash and fireworks, which would seem to point toward Flash, toward Flash Trump. Maybe that's a nickname that I.
There you go.
I think it's going to be very close, and I think we will say when it's over that we've probably never had an election between two dissimilar people.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think Trump would be dissimilar to just about anybody. It's interesting that you brought up a really good point about Democrats sort of settling on Biden. And in many ways, that's what Republicans did in 1920 with Harding, because I think that Teddy Roosevelt actually was the sort of front runner for being the Republican nominee, and then he died in December of 1919, and Republicans were kind of like, "Oh crap, we don't really have anybody. Let's settle for this guy because he looks like he's the president." And so, yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how this election turns out. Thank you so much, Mr. Burns, for your time. I don't want to keep you, but thank you so much for everything.
I'm not being kept. I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, Chris.
No problem. Thanks a lot. And thanks everyone for listening in as well. Thank you.